It's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you Father Brokert Sewell of the Order of Carmelites of the Observance. And what we hope to do tonight is to provide you with an introduction to the work and to the thought of one of the great sculptors and engravers of our time, Eric Gill. Father Sewell has a number of slides that he's going to show as part of the lecture to make it a quite comprehensive introduction. We'll have, after Father Sewell's presentation, we'll have a coffee break, and if you'd like to stay around and ask Father Sewell questions, he's more than willing to oblige you. The Center annually mounts various programs that follow a certain theme, whether they're addressing native rights issues or Jewish-Catholic relations or issues of social justice. But it also has part of its program an effort to mount various events that deal with the relationship of the arts to Christianity. Brian Moore, for instance, last year, and it's a little too loud, Ernie. Brian Moore last year, and Josef Skalecki, the Czechoslovakian novelist, provided really quite remarkable reflections on the nature of the arts and religious sensibility. This year, Brokert Sewell has come all the way from England to be part of a nationwide program in which this lecture will be given at the University of Prince Edward Island, at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, and indeed at the University of Toronto. But he begins here. And he comes well equipped to talk about Eric Gill. As a writer himself, somebody who was familiar with the work of G.K. Chesterton, the whole Chester Belloc movement in the English Catholic Renaissance, as somebody who knew Gill, and somebody who was familiar with his environment, he comes eminently equipped to talk about his life and his work. Father Sewell was a Carmelite priest in England and a writer. He's written extensively about various fin de siècle writers, particularly John Gray, André Sebastian Rafalovich, and Olive Custance, about whom he's written extensively. On John Gray alone, his most recent work in the Dorian mode has received very, very positive indeed reviews by the British press. In addition, Father Sewell is the author of works on Montague Summers, an important work that appeared in 1970 called The Vatican Oracle, various essays on the presses and the art of engraving, and a marvelous collection of essays entitled Like Black Swans. The first volume of his autobiography, My Dear Time's Waste, appeared in the 60s, and he's presently working on his second volume entitled Habit of a Lifetime. It is my pleasure tonight, on behalf of St. Jerome's and the St. Jerome Center, to welcome Father Brokert Sewell, who has come here to give us a lecture on Eric Gill, an illustrated lecture. Brokert?
Now, if you can't hear, can you hear me all right or not? One never knows with these modern instruments. If at any point you can't hear, perhaps you'd put your hand up or somehow signify. It's a great pleasure to me to have been invited to talk to you about somebody I admire so much as Eric Gill. I have been advised to speak as though most of you knew very little about Eric Gill, which may perhaps be so or not. But those of you who've seen the very fine exhibition of printed books and other things by Eric Gill in the university library will in fact know quite a lot about him. If you haven't seen this exhibition, I hope that while it's still on, you will go and see it. It's very well arranged, full of the most remarkable things that, I mean, I was astonished to find these things here as though they'd been found on the moon. It's really quite extraordinary what's there. Nobody seems to know how they got here. It's been a great pleasure to me to see all these wonderful things. And the exhibition is arranged very cleverly, really, according to the three places that this man, Eric Gill, principally lived and worked in. As a very young man, he was in London. Then he soon moved to a place called Ditchling, 40 miles south of London, where he was there about 10 years. Then he moved to a disused monastery in the Black Mountains in Wales, was there 4 years, and finally he settled at a place called Pigott's, near High Wycombe, perhaps 30 miles out of London. And the exhibition in the University Library shows what things he was doing and making and designing at these three different places, three successive stages. However, my talk is arranged on a rather different method. And Eric Gill, like William Morris, for example, was one of these amazing all-round artists and craftsmen who seemed to be able to do practically anything. They could make furniture, they could build houses, they could paint pictures, they could do engravings, they could print books, they could carve in wood and stone, and so on and so on. And on any one of these different fields in which Gill worked, one could give a talk on any one of them. But I've tried to give a sort of conspectus or general survey of the kind of things that he did and made and was interested in. But chiefly I've concentrated on his work in connection with the printed book, because that's a field that I'm more at home in myself than with sculpture and engraving and so on. So, Eric Gill then was born in Brighton, a seaside town 40 miles south of London, in 1882, and died in November 1940 at the early age of 59. Into these years, once he had left school, he put an enormous physical and spiritual energy, turning out an impressive number of works of art of varying kinds: sculpture, wood engravings, celebratory and memorial inscriptions carved in wood or stone, designs for printing typefaces, printed books, etc. He was born in the reign of Queen Victoria and had in full measure the Victorian urge to communicate and to teach. Hence the 20 or 30 books that he wrote, and a long tale of letters to the press on matters of controversy. He was also in demand as a lecturer. In this he resembled his elder contemporary William Morris, the propagandist of socialism, who, like Gill, was an all-round craftsman who could turn his hand to almost anything. Gill was certainly influenced by Morris, but he did not share all of Morris's ideas, and seems to have thought that he had been more greatly influenced by Ruskin. Eric Gill was a profoundly religious man. The son of a clergyman, he did not react against religion as the sons of the clergy, not the Roman Catholic clergy, of course, often do. But instead he followed his father in his progress from one of the Protestant sects into the established church, the Church of England, and then of his own accord made the transition to the Roman Catholic Church, in which he became one of the most prominent laymen in the England of his day. In his lifetime, Eric Gill was regarded as a highly controversial figure. His sculpture was for a long time considered to be archaic and anachronistic in style, and his views on social questions were thought to be fanciful and simplistic. His religion, that of the Roman Catholics, was unpopular in the country, but the hierarchs of that religion viewed him with considerable suspicion, partly because of the erotic character of some of his carvings and engravings, partly because of his support for a society, Artists International, which advocated cultural exchange by way of exhibitions and so on between Britain and the Soviet Union. Hence he was sometimes accused of being a communist, which was far from being so. But he believed in talking to the Russians, getting to know them, understand them a bit. After his death, Gill's reputation declined, as is often the way, and there was a tendency among critics to disparage his work, his sculpture especially. All this changed in 1982, the year which saw the centenary of his birth. A powerful factor in this was undoubtedly a new biographical study of Gill by Malcolm York, not a book that those who knew Gill especially admire, but one that has been very useful in reviving interest in him in a big way. In 1982, there were at least 6 exhibitions of Gill's work, 3 of them in London, a number of lectures on him in different parts of the country, and a weekend conference on his life and work held at a Dominican priory in the Midlands. Interest in him has not diminished since. There are 3 biographies or biographical studies of Eric Gill, all in the University Library here. First of all, Life of Eric Gill by Robert Spate, a very good, solid biography. Secondly, A Cell of Good Living by Donald Atwater, much the best of the 3 books, because Atwater was a close friend of Gill's and actually lived with him for a number of years. And thirdly, there is this new book, not much liked by those who knew Gill, but useful, by Eric Gill by Malcolm York. Eric Gill did not travel widely, so that relatively little of his carving in wood or stone is to be seen outside the United Kingdom. Apart from his carved panels on the exterior of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and his huge sculpture called The Recreation of Man on the League of Nations building in Geneva. I'm told there is a crucifix by Eric Gill I think it's in the chapel at Hart House in Toronto, that I have not yet seen. The finest general collection of his work probably is that in the William Andrews Clark Library at Los Angeles, which now possesses his diaries, not yet available for general inspection, and an immense wealth of designs, engravings, and manuscripts. Even in Britain, the amount of his work in museums and art galleries is smaller than one might expect, because he tended to disapprove of such places. His carvings are to be found all over the country in Britain, but mostly in churches and on public buildings, with countless memorials in small churchyards. With his engravings it is different. So many of these were published as illustrations or decorations to books, by no means all of them in expensive limited editions, and recently all his wood engravings have been reprinted in one large handsome volume, price $200, and his writings also, his 30 books and so on, are very accessible. There's a very good range of his books in the University Library, and this big new collected edition of pretty well all his engravings, that's in the University Library as well, together with 2 earlier printed collections of the engravings. So all this is very accessible for you to see. The one field in which Eric Gill's mastery has never been questioned is in that of lettering, the drawing and carving and inscribing of letters, the making of inscriptions, and also the designing of typefaces for the printing of books. Now, Gill was brought up mostly in the small cathedral city of Chichester, very, very near the south coast of England, and he was much influenced by Chichester, which is a Roman town very compactly laid out, not at all higgledy-piggledy like most English towns and villages. But when he left school, he was apprenticed to an architect in London. But he did not complete his apprenticeship. However, later in his life, he did one or two notable works of architecture, and while he was an apprentice with this architect in London as a very, very young man, just after leaving school, he did a number of architectural designs for different kinds of buildings, most of which, in fact, were never actually built. One or two were. And these are very beautiful architectural plans, which he's coloured in watercolour, I suppose. And they are exceedingly rare. There can't be a great number of them. And there are actually two here in the University Library, which seems to me most extraordinary. There's his plan or design for extensions to the house that he bought on Ditchling Common in Sussex, and a design for a building, a picture of a building. I think it's called A Building in Utopia or something like that. Anyway, it looks a very attractive building, and that is here, and certainly very few people in the old world have seen that. I've never seen it before. Yes, when he gave up his architecture because he found it on the whole rather boring, he went to learn calligraphy or formal lettering from a certain Edward Johnston, who was one of the great calligraphers, writers of the century. And then he went from writing or inscribing letters, he graduated to carving them in wood and stone, and from carving letters he went on to carve the human figure and other subjects. Almost by accident he found that he could be a sculptor in the ordinary sense of the word. Eric Gill seems to have been the first modern artist in Britain to carve figures directly in stone, without first making a clay model of the intended figure, and then translating it into stone with the aid of a device called a pointing machine. Very, very decadent, miserable way of doing things, but that was the way it was before Gill came along. Since Gill's images were carved directly in stone, and with respect for the nature of stone, thus avoiding all naturalism, they are in some respects not unlike European medieval sculpture, carved figures on the cathedral at Chartres, for example, and also not unlike the classic Oriental sculptures at Ajanta and other Indian holy places. That is why he was accused of archaism or conscious artifice, a charge that he had to meet when the public first saw, in 1918, his Stations of the Cross in Westminster Cathedral. As he explained, he carved like that because it was the only way he could carve. The Westminster Stations were commissioned in 1913 by the then Archbishop and completed in 1918. They were carved at Ditchling, this little tiny place in Sussex, 40 miles south of London, to which he'd moved from London in 1907. Now, if we could have the first slide, please. I don't know what we're going to see. Yes, this is going on just a very few years. Eventually, Gill, with a friend of his, a man called Douglas, later known as Hilary Pepler, they founded a kind of community or guild of like-minded Catholic craftsmen, and they set up workshops on some land on Ditchling Common, and this shows you two of the workshops. The end piece with the chimneys, that was where Gill had his workshop till he left in 1924. And the other part of that building is the building which housed Pepler's famous St. Dominic's press, where all the printing was done by hand. The type was set by hand. The printing was done on old iron hand presses, and as far as possible on handmade paper. The little building over there, that's the Guild Chapel. They used to sing, or at least to say, and very often to sing, the Little Office of Our Lady at the different hours, three times a day. That's how it was in the early days of the Ditchling community, as it used to be called. Yes, now. In 1916, Gill was joined at Ditchling by his London neighbour Hilary Pepler, a social worker for the London County Council, who had set up his own publishing business and now wanted to do his own printing. Gill was by now a Roman Catholic, and Pepler, who was a Quaker, adopted that faith also in 1917. Both men had come under the influence of the Dominican order, to which they had been introduced by Andrei Rafalovich, a wealthy connoisseur, himself a poet and novelist, wealthy patron of the arts. In March 1917, Gill and his friend Pepler visited together the Dominican Priory at Hawksyard in the English Midlands. Gill had been invited to talk to the community of friars there, and the Priory's Novitiate Chronicle has this entry for March the 22nd, 1917. This is, of course, is a private document, never been printed or published. And the Novitiate Chronicle says, Mr. Gill has carved the Stations of the Cross at Westminster. He is a convert of but a few years' standing. His age is 35. The purpose of his visit was to lay his position as an artist before a group of men who profess a philosophical and theological training. His first lecture was delivered in the library. Mr. Gill explained his attitude towards art and beauty. Beauty, he said, was absolute with a capital A quality of the divinity. Art is the expressing of beauty as the artist conceives it. This is not at all how Eric Gill would have put it a few years later, after he had studied the book Art et Scolastique, published in English as The Philosophy of Art, by the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, whose teaching was based in large part on the ideas of the medieval scholastics, and Thomas Aquinas and such people, for whom art was simply the right making of whatever needs making, recta ratio factibilium. That's very different from all that kind of pre-Raphaelite and earlier Romantic conception of art, and the notion of the artist as trying to, express the beautiful and express himself through and in and through beauty, and so on and so on. The medievals thought, and Gill quite thoroughly agreed with them, that art in actual fact, it probably comes from Aristotle if one went back far enough, that art is simply the right making of whatever needs making. And that cuts out a whole lot of art nonsense, as Gill would call it. So Gill later held that the artist is not a special kind of man, but every man is a special kind of artist, and preferred to call himself a workman rather than an artist. And of course, believing that every man is or should be a special kind of artist, it's obvious that the modern mass production factory way of making things was to Eric Gill a kind of blasphemy and an anathema, reducing, as has been said by a learned Jesuit, reducing the worker to a subhuman condition of intellectual irresponsibility, which is indeed the case. In making the Stations of the Cross for Westminster Cathedral, he only got the job because his tender was the cheapest, because he's completely unknown. But in making these stations, Gill did not set out to create a series of beautiful works of art. His aim was simply to provide 14 functional pieces of church furniture, carving them in such a way as not to distort or conceal the material of which they were made, stone in this case, and to create from the stone the required series of formal devotional images. Gill's great friend and former pupil, the late Father Desmond Chute, himself a fine painter and engraver, thought that the 12th of the Westminster Stations is the finest of the series. Right, now if you could have the next slide, please. Can you see that all right, I wonder? It's a bit faint, but you can get the general notion of it. 12th station, naturally 14 panels carved over 3 or 4 years, obviously are going to be of rather varying merit. And probably Father Chute was right in saying that this one really is the best. We've got slides of 3 more, so if we could have them in fairly quick succession. Now these are interesting, I beg your pardon. These are the designs for a later set of stations done for a church in Bradford, an industrial town in the English Midlands. And many good judges think that these really are better even than the Westminster stations. But it's very odd that the Stations of the Cross designed for a church frequented by mass-producing factory workers should have the inscriptions in Greek. I don't know whose idea that was. Obviously none of the parishioners can possibly have made anything of them at all. Strange. Perhaps it was the rector who wanted it that way. Right. Now. Yes. Eric Gill did not approve of sculpture or mosaic being used to decorate modern buildings. Works of sculpture are made, or should be made, by free men, responsible craftsmen. Modern buildings are erected by proletarian hands who have no creative responsibility of their own, but work to an architect's directions. The two worlds, the industrial world and the humane world, are quite distinct, and on one level, each is good in its own way, and it's a mistake to try and combine them. Hence, in Gill's view, the foolishness of the attempt to decorate the interior of Westminster Cathedral. And if any of you have seen the interior of that glorious modern Byzantine building, Westminster Cathedral, you'll know exactly what he meant. The decorations, apart from Gill stations, are mostly deplorable beyond words. But Eric Gill was not a narrow doctrinaire. He was also a husband, a father, and the head of a family that he had to support. He was normally willing to give a customer what he wanted, even if it was not what he himself would have recommended. This sometimes exposed him to charges of inconsistency, but happily for us, we can see many fine carvings by him on the exterior of public buildings, where they are for all to see free of charge, which is surely better than having to seek them out in museums and art galleries, although, of course, works by him are to be found in such places. Thus, in London we have the Stations of the Cross in Westminster Cathedral, and Prospero and Ariel over the portals of Broadcasting House. Next slide, please. We've got another Station of the Cross here, never mind. And some more still. Here we go. Yes, this is over the main entrance to the BBC building in London. That's Mr. Gill down below, chipping away with his hammer and chisel. You can't see the whole of it here. Prospero and Ariel. Gill thought the whole of that business was really rather comic. The BBC sort of trying to put itself forward as a great source of culture and edification and all that kind of thing, which was a bit of a joke in Gill's eyes. And actually, Gill was not a great fan of the Bard. He hadn't really much time for Shakespeare. He didn't read Shakespeare. He was really bored by Shakespeare, I think. So he said, in actual fact, although this ostensibly is Prospero and Ariel, from his point of view, it's God the Father and God the Son. So you can take it which way you like. Officially, it's Prospero and Ariel. And it is, it's one of the finest carvings you'll see on any building in London. It's absolutely splendid. Also for the BBC, he did this. The next slide will show us. Well, this is when it's in the making. Another big carving he did for the BBC of the Sower. Again, this was in the days of Sir John Reith, the great Director General of the BBC. He was a very, a man who wanted to edify people. That was his idea. He wanted people to, raise themselves up a bit and become more sort of cultivated and spiritual and so on. Very good. So he commissioned the statue of the sower going forth to sow his seed. The idea of the BBC being a great disseminator of culture and all that. I don't know whether it is or not. I don't think Gill thought it was. But here you see, when he was carving in stone, he usually he didn't have any of this clay model business like some sculptors did, because what's the point of modelling in clay when you're going to make the thing in something totally different? But he would always do a little model in stone. And when he'd done that, he'd then get going on the real thing, the big one. And there you see the sort of halfway stage. At the same time that Gill was becoming known as a sculptor, he began to make a reputation as an engraver of wood blocks for the illustration of books. Much the best, of course, it's obsolete today, unfortunately, but really the best method of illustrating a book is by wood engravings, rather than by your modern, well, of course, now it's all done so simply and wonderfully with your photo reproducing process. But the old line blocks, as they were called, and the half-tone blocks and so on, they had none of the quality and the humanity of the wood engraving. In this field, his first collaboration with a publisher was in 1915, when he made a series of wood engravings to illustrate his friend Pepler's book, a kind of satire on the bureaucracy of the London County Council, a book called The Devil's Devices. In the next year, after he'd moved to Ditchling, Pepler set up his own printing office, St. Dominic's Press, there, starting with a Stanhope iron hand press made in 1970, said to belong to William Morris. At the St. Dominic's Press, all type was set by hand and printed by hand, as far as possible on handmade paper. Pepler thought rightly that this was a pleasanter way of doing things than working with a typesetting machine and power presses, because it gave the printer much greater control over his work and its products. It was still possible in 1919 or so to make a living by these rather primitive non-industrial methods, and Pepler did so more or less for the next 20 years. In Ditchling, Gill was his neighbour, as he had been earlier in London, and a large proportion of Gill's earlier wood engravings were made to embellish books that Pepler was printing and publishing. And some of the books from Pepler's St. Dominic's Press are in the exhibition in the University Library. In 1924, after a disagreement with Pepler, Gill and his family left Ditchling Common and settled for a few years in a disused monastery in Wales. There's a very fine big photograph, I think an aerial photograph of it in the exhibition. No longer working for St. Dominic's Press, Gill now became involved with Robert Gibbings's Golden Cockerel Press, not in Buckinghamshire, not far from London. This was a very different enterprise from the St. Dominic's Press, though its methods of work were basically the same. Although he did some nice smaller books, Robert Gibbings is principally known as the printer of splendid folios in the tradition of William Morris's Kelmscott Press, Cobden Sanderson's Dove's Press, and St. John Hornby's Ashendene Press. All these presses produced superb books, great folios that big, with marvellous illustrations and illuminations and all the rest of it. Gill preferred small books to large, and believed that books should be for reading rather than for display as sumptuous objets d'art. He also shared Pepler's dislike of elaborate editions produced for rich connoisseurs. So when Gibbings first approached him, Gill refused his cooperation, but Gibbings soon won him over and was fortunate in doing so. In the 1950s, after Gill's death, Robert Gibbings published an article, Memories of Eric Gill, in which he recalled that in the early days of their association, Gill engraved wood blocks for Golden Cockerel publications without having seen proofs of the pages on which they were to appear. Gibbings simply told Gill the subject of the picture that he wanted and left him to get on with it. Thus, on the finished printed page, there was no real marriage of wood and metal. As Eric Gill used to insist, a wood engraving is really just another piece of type, so the two ought to match. It was not until the magnificent The Four Gospels, printed in 1931, that the designing of the engravings and the cutting of the wood were related closely to the setting of the type. The Four Gospels was necessarily a big book. Its format would not have been Gill's choice if he had had any say in the matter. It had to be a big book because Gill's newly designed Golden Cockerel typeface was as yet available only in the 18-point size, and that's a big size. Gill's sole contribution to the typography of the Four Gospels was the setting of the text with an unjustified, that is, with an uneven right-hand edge, so as to secure absolute evenness of word spacing. This was one of Gill's favourite ideas. Gibbings did not really care for it, and afterwards regretted having allowed it. We're all used in the printed books that we read to it having the printed page, the text having a margin where it starts off on the left-hand side, and a dead equal margin straight down on the right-hand side. And to fit into, suppose the page is that long, to fit your line of words in, letter by letter, word by word, if you're going to have a dead even right-hand edge, you cannot have absolutely even spacing between the words. You've got either to make the spacing between some of the words a little wider than between the others, or a little narrower, and that's how you get your perfect right-hand edge. Gill thought that for ease of reading, it's much more important to have the words on the printed page absolutely evenly spaced, preferably with narrow spacing between the words, thus avoiding those awkward pockets and rivers of white space that you get on a badly composed printed page. And this can be done because if you sacrifice your even right-hand edge and have a ragged right-hand edge, not too ragged but within a certain margin, then you can get dead even spacing right through. This was one of Gill's favourite ideas. It never really hasn't really caught on with printers, but still one can see the point of it. Yes, could we have the next slide, please? Well, now, this is not strictly to the point. Before Gill designed his own typefaces for various printers, he said that by far the best printing typeface available in England was a type called Caslon Oldface, designed by a London type designer and printer, William Caslon, in the 18th century. And this is a letter that Eric Gill wrote for a magazine in 1917, explaining why he's so keen on Caslon Oldface. And a modern printer who lives just up the road from where I live, has a very fine press. He's reprinted this letter, you see, because he uses Caslon typeface only himself, and this shows you all the various sizes from the big, 48 point or whatever it is, right down to the little 12 point at the bottom. So that's what that is. Yes, Robert Gibbings said, in something that he wrote later on, that Gill was tremendously conscientious about everything that he was asked to do. If he said a block would be ready on a certain date, it would infallibly be in the post delivered on that morning. And then he says, Gibbings is saying, Gill did some splendid work for his own firm in later years, but I like to think that those engravings that he did for our edition of the Gospels were the greatest he ever produced. The next slide might perhaps show us. No, well, no, never mind, they're a bit jumbled, I'm afraid. This is the only example, and it's been sort of blown up so big that all the fine detail is lost. But this is an engraving, a frontispiece for a book that was printed at the St. Dominic's Press, Autumn Midnight, poems by Francis Cornford, quite a well-known poet of the day. And in actual fact, when you see the real thing, that is one of Gill's most beautiful engravings, but it suffered badly in being enlarged there. Eric Gill's own firm was the firm of Haig and Gill, whose printing office he set up at his final home, Piggott's, outside London, in 1928. The press was set up in partnership with his son-in-law, René Haig, to whom he soon made over the full ownership of the enterprise by a legal deed of gift. René had learned printing at the Golden Cockerel Press. You couldn't learn it anywhere better. From which, however, he'd been sacked by Robert Gibbings, as he had been from his previous employment with George Coldwell, Catholic bookseller and publisher in London. Of Irish origin, René had been educated at Ampleforth by the Benedictine monks, and had then somehow left Oxford without taking his degree. In fact, he was a pretty wild young Irishman. But once his father, I think Gill sort of cast about, what can I do with this young man who's going to marry my daughter? I'm going to do something to get him on the even path. And he hit on this idea of having him trained as a printer, which worked out extremely well. And with the press at Pigott's, Rene had found his feet and became one of the best printers in England. Eric left the running of the press mostly to Rene, obtaining commissions for him, designing some of the books to be printed, and supplying blocks for illustrations and decorations. Between them, there was a constant interchange of ideas on typography in general, and the productions of the Hagen Gill press in particular. In a letter printed in the autumn number of the Monotype Recorder in 1933, Gill said, "It is not true that I have started a private press." Private press really means one of those presses where it's usually a small thing where everything is done by hand, or at any rate it's done by just 2 or 3 craftsmen, a very small enterprise producing rather elegant and costly books. So he wasn't pleased when it was put about that he was starting a private press, because he didn't really believe in that kind of thing. It would be strictly correct, he says, to say that we have started a printing business, the style of the firm being Hagen Gill Printers. He adds that it is difficult to define the term private press, but insists that the firm of Hagen Gill cannot be so described. However, booksellers' catalogues continue to list Hagen Gill books as private press books, and to some extent this is defensible. The history of the Hagen Gill press shows 3 distinct phases. The first at Pigott's, where they had an Albion hand press, that would be very nearly 100 years old, and a Columbian hand press, an American invention, that would be about 100 years old too. There was a Columbian press. Pepler had one at the St. Dominic's Press. It's the most spectacular and handsome thing, with a marvellous painted eagle, a metal eagle on top. It looks beautiful. But for printing it proved to be absolutely useless. It was just used as a dumping ground for things that needed to be put somewhere. Anyway. So at Pigott's they had an Albion and a Columbian hand press, and an automatic, a powered press called an Autovic. The type was set by hand and was mostly Gill's Joanna typeface, named after his daughter who'd married his son-in-law Rene. This type, the Joanna, was at first exclusive to the firm of Hagen Gill. It was not until the early 1950s that the Monotype Corporation made it generally available to printers and publishers. In its second stage, the press was registered as a limited company and moved to premises in High Wycombe, and it had a commercial link-up with a big firm of London publishers called J.M. Dent & Sons Limited, and then the press's products did become decidedly not private. Press, an essay on typography by Eric Gill, appeared just before Christmas 1931. 200 copies signed by the author were printed on a grey handmade paper with the special Hagen Gill watermark. The type, Joanna, was set by hand with unjustified lines, uneven right-hand edge. The book contains numerous engravings by Gill of alphabets, examples of good and bad individual letters, and specimens of Caslin, Baskerville, and other classic typefaces. A commercial edition of the book was printed and published in 1936. Both these editions, the hand-printed edition and the commercial edition, they're both you can see them both in the exhibition. They're both very, very nice. Typography is the most stimulating treatment of its subject and is a useful and very readable manual both for printers and publishers, and for any general reader who wants to clarify his or her ideas about printing and the making of books. However, the press's next book John Gray's short novel, Park, A Fantastic Story, John Gray was, in the 1890s, a very elegant young man about town, man of fashion, young civil servant, an up-and-coming, rather decadent poet of the day, who later on became a very distinguished Catholic priest in Edinburgh and was a very close friend of Gill's. So the next book from Gill's press was this story by Father Gray, Park, A Fantastic Story, which was set in Joanna Italic. Very unusual to set a book for general reading, a novel, in an italic typeface. But the Joanna Italic is very beautiful and very readable and rather less sloping than the normal italic. And in fact, it hasn't got any capital letters. Ordinary Roman letters are used for capitals. So this was an interesting experiment. However, it was set in the Joanna Italic, but with an even right-hand edge to the page. And this book is a triumphant demonstration of how a really skilled compositor, or setter of type by hand, can achieve almost perfect even spacing of the words on a page without sacrificing the page's even right-hand edge. I think it's very doubtful whether by machine composition on a typesetting machine, even the best of them, you could achieve that. In Park, the Joanna Italic was aligned at the beginning of the sentences, yes, that's with the Roman capitals, and so on. Now there ought to be, the next slide might be, I hope it is, but no, never mind, they've got a bit out of order, it doesn't matter. This is from the very magnificent Four Gospels produced by the Golden Cockerel Press, and you can see that in the exhibition in the University Library also, at an opening rather like that, but with a different engraving, and the actual wood block from which the printing's been done, that's there alongside the book, and the sort of blank spaces that don't print are filled in with a white chalky substance called gesso, and if you do that, these blocks become permanent sort of objets d'art, like pieces of sculpture. So that's a very typical page from the Four Gospels, with the Golden Cockerel typeface designed by Gill for Gibbings in the big size, the 18-point, and you can see how absolutely perfectly the wood engraving blends in with the type. That's an absolute model of how to do it, if that's what you're interested in doing. Right, we'll try the next slide and see what happens. Yes, here we go. Park, A Fantastic Story by John Gray. First edition, Hagen Gill, 1932, 200 copies only printed on a grey handmade paper with the special Eric and René watermark. Set in the Joanna Italic with the Roman capitals. Park is a story, a short novel of the sort of William Morris News from Nowhere, sort of time traveller type of thing. And it's a kind of vision of a utopian society in England at some future period where the English people, us, our descendants, we've turned into a rodent-like race of creatures inhabiting great subterranean caverns and tunnels. And the people who live on the surface, above ground, they are all black. John Gray was very interested in the black man. Mungo Park, you see, the priest who has this adventure, Mungo Park, obviously is called after the great African explorer Mungo Park. it's a kind of theocratic Catholic society, and here you see the man in the sort of monk's habit. He, in actual fact, is a black man, in actual fact. He's one of the ecclesiastical dignitaries, and the two soldiers, they're black men with those sort of Roman helmets. They're sort of driving a path so that he can get through these hordes of rodent-like subterranean inhabitants of our island, or their descendants. So that's what the story is about. And if you look at this page, you will see that the spacing between the words is pretty well even. It's just about as even as you could possibly get. At the same time, you've got the even right-hand margin. So really, it's a kind of typographical miracle, that. I don't know how Rennie did it, but then he was a kind of typographical genius. And Park is not in the exhibition, but in the fine books, the rare books library, there's a copy. You can see a copy of Park in this edition, and in the much less typographically attractive but quite nice 1966 second edition, with an introduction by Bernard Bergonzi, a very good critic. And Park is about to go into paperback, which is great news, because it's not been a popular book. It's a book known to relatively few people, but its merits have now been sort of recognized, and it's coming out in a cheap paperback edition in November, which is very good news. Well, that we're talking about Park, aren't we? Yes. Finally, in respect of the Hagen Gill Press, we should mention the Hamlet. You will find a photocopy of the title page of the Hamlet, which I think I'm going to show you in a minute. But there is a photocopy of it in the exhibition. This is a compact little book, about that size. Park's about, in fact, all Gill's books are about that size. That's the size that he liked. Crown Octavo, 8x5 or something. And Park's, and the Hamlet's like that. The Hamlet was printed for the Fine Edition Society or something of New York. Yes, 1,500 copies printed in 1933 for the Limited Editions Club of New York. Now, if we have the next slide, well, we're still on Park, but there's the Joanna type magnified up, so that you can really see how good it is. Very elegant. Now, I will try the next slide, please. Yes, here's your Hamlet. Various nice little scenes from the play. They also did Shakespeare's King Henry VIII, but I don't think Gill was very thrilled by Henry VIII, and the title page to the Henry VIII, that also is in the exhibition, and it's a bit feeble compared to the Hamlet one, which is I think is very good. There might be another Hamlet one to follow, another picture. Could have the next slide, please. Yes, there again you see, this is, in 1933, when this was done, Gill had developed an entirely new style of wood engraving. This is quite unlike his earlier engravings. And he did about 6 of these pictures for the Hamlet. Of course, again, this has been magnified, and the fine detail is lost. But it's good enough to see what it's like. And it's a good idea to stick stick the dramatis personae and things in the margin. That also is a good way to print a play, I think. Yes, in all Eric Gill designed 11 typefaces, including Greek, Hebrew and Arabic. And these 11, the Arabic actually has never been cut. Perhaps some rich oil magnate will latch onto it one of these days. It ought to be done. These typefaces by Eric Gill have achieved worldwide fame, and most of them were designed especially for the Monotype Corporation, so that they quickly became available in many countries. They were designed, you see, not specifically for private presses and printing by hand and that kind of thing. They are designed for mechanical typesetting and printing. Now, the first of all the typefaces that Gill designed is possibly the best. It's called Perpetua. And it was first used in a book of Eric Gill's essays, a fine big book, came out in 1929 called Art Nonsense and Other Essays. This book, unfortunately, is only in the exhibition in a small commercial reprint of no particular merit. They haven't got here, unfortunately, and I can't give them one because I gave them mine away years ago, a copy of the original edition. I'm not really competent to explain to you just why the Perpetua is such good lettering, so instead I will show you a reproduction of the title page of Art Nonsense with its beautiful wood engraving of La Belle Sauvage, of which Gill made two versions. Could we have the next slide, please? Well, they seem to have got a bit jumbled. This is just an example of his lettering. This is reproduced from lettering that is drawn. It's a piece of inscription. It's not done from type. It's drawn and then photographed. Quite early in the century, he was designing these title pages for a German publisher, I think in Leipzig. He did 3 or 4 books for them. That's one. So we'll try the next slide. Here we are. Art Nonsense and Other Essays by Eric Gill, London, Castle and Company, and Francis Wolferson, 1929. Look carefully at the picture, the engraving. Yes, the engraving, you see, is of La Belle Sauvage, the beautiful savage. And the premises of Castles, the publishers, were on the site of an 18th century tavern called La Belle Sauvage. And the model for this Belle Sauvage was the late Mrs. Beatrice Ward, who was the publicity officer to the Monotype Corporation. It's obvious that a model holding this pose for considerable stretches of time would need strong leg muscles. In a paper given at the Symposium on the Life and Work of Eric Gill held in Los Angeles in 1968, Mrs. Ward, who was an American by birth, said, "I was fortunate to have an excellent torso and splendid American legs. And as Eric Gill would never use a professional model, his family and friends were all pressed into service, and we had to be prepared at any moment, if we happened to have good carcasses, you see, to allow them to be the object of study. And this was, as I say, done, I want to testify, with the utmost purity and goodness." I'm not sure whether we've got it or not, but he did two. Yes, well, that's the same one, I think. magnified up. Yes, that's right. Excuse me, just watch the time. Let's see here. Well, we should draw to a close at this stage. Well, we'll just try the next 4 slides in quick succession, if we may. Yes, that's another book from the Hague and Gill Press. That's Lawrence Stern's Sentimental Journey. Right, next one, please. That's another Hamlet, printed by Gill's friend Count Kessler at his Cranach Press at Weimar earlier in the century. The engraving on the right, that's by Gordon Craig, not by Eric Gill. But Gill did a lot of capital letters, which I don't think, this doesn't show them, but anyway, that's another book that he was concerned in or with. Right, next one. Now towards the end of his life, Eric Gill turned back to architecture. He was asked to design a church at a place called Galstone-on-Sea on the east coast, and he was one of the first people in England who had this idea that it would be much better if the altar in a church was in the middle, with the people all round it, rather than the altar being right away at the east end, with the clergy like a special sort of high-grade Hindu caste or something, quite separate from the people. Gill was a pioneer of this notion of getting the altar right back and having the people close to it and even right round it. And the Bishop of Northampton, English bishops certainly are not usually the most enlightened of men, but the then Bishop of Northampton was an enlightened man, and he agreed to this scheme, and this church was built. What I find amusing about it is that Gill had absolutely no time for modern Gothic architecture. He said it's ridiculous building buildings in the Gothic manner in the 20th century when we've got concrete and goodness knows what. And yet here you see, in spite of himself, he's designed clearly a Gothic building. I don't know whether he realized quite what he'd done. Anyway, that's just, by the way, a little example of what he was doing towards the end. We've no time really to tell you anything about his books, but he wrote about 30 books, I should think, and most of them seem to be in the university library. The essential one, if one's interested in Eric Gill, of course, is his autobiography. As a record, in a way it's disappointing, because he's not got a great deal to say about other people. He doesn't hear anything about Count Kessler. He says very little about his Dominican friends. Nothing about Pepler, with whom he'd quarrelled anyway, but an interesting and brilliant man. But as an account of the development of Gill's mind and his thought and his opinions, it's very, very good, a splendid book. He also wrote a kind of popular philosophical work called The Necessity of Belief, which really, in a sort of very simple and indirect way, demonstrates how it is that he is a believer rather than a non-believer. And then he wrote his letters are very good reading. There's a volume of his letters. And the other books, they're all essays on art in one way or another. He's a very good, clear, straightforward writer. At the end of his life, he became very involved in the peace movement, which was active in 1938. The Peace Pledge Union, by that Anglican clergyman, started by Dick Shepherd, who became Dean of Canterbury, was nothing like CND today, but it was a big, forceful thing. And there was a small Catholic affair called the Pax Society, And Gill really spent himself lecturing and writing when he was a sick man for this cause, but of course the war had to come anyway. They just weren't powerful enough to stop it, so that was that. Well, in the end, Eric Gill died. He felt it was appropriate he should die. He said, having written this autobiography, he said, I feel really I've sort of exposed myself too much, and I'd be quite happy to get out of it now, which is what happened. He was an inveterate smoker. He rolled his own cigarettes, inveterate chain smoker really, and of course the tobacco plus the inhaling all the stone dust from his carving, that got at his lungs, and he had an operation which he seemed to be recovering, but then there was a relapse and he collapsed, and that was that. Well, what Gill was interested in really, apart from all these activities and things that he did, he was interested in the idea of what makes a really good human life, and how ought human beings really to live. Quite clearly not as we live in our modern Western mechanized, industrialized world. Absolutely not. And although he did a great deal of work, he had no objection to working for big corporations like the Monotype people, the BBC, etc., because you've got to earn your living, and you do more or less what's within limits, what is asked of you. But he didn't approve of the industrial way that we live at all. And in his own personal life, he tried to organize things in a much simpler, more humane kind of way. And at the end, on the end of his autobiography, he says, "If I might attempt to state in one paragraph the work which I have chiefly tried to do in my life, it is this: to make a cell of good living in the chaos of our world. Lettering, type designing, engraving, stone carving, drawing, these things are all very well. They are the means to the service of God and of our fellows, therefore to the earning of a living, and I have earned my living by them. But what I hope above all things is that I have done something towards reintegrating bed and board, the small farm and the small workshop, the home and the school, earth and heaven." And what more proper object, one might ask, could one have in life than that? Now there are one or two more slides just to round it off, I think. Yes, here is Mr. Gill with I think probably his greatest piece of sculpture, an enormous thing that he did. It's on the League of Nations building at Geneva, and it's called The Recreation of Man. Well, if you see the whole thing, there are some little reproductions of it in the exhibition, actually. If you see the whole thing, there's... Now, what is this? This is Adam we're looking at here. And up there, several yards away, is the hand of God reaching out from heaven. And this is called, the whole thing is called the recreation of man. As Gill himself said in his joking kind of way, when the thing was finished, he said, "I think I've seen something like this before." Well, of course, we've all seen something like that before. It's Michelangelo's thing in the Sistine Chapel, isn't it? The creation. So this one he called the recreation of man. And up on the top left-hand corner, there's the Latin inscription, ad imaginem Dei creavit illum. God, that is, created man in the image of God, that's right. And then down at the bottom left, There's a quotation from Jerome Hopkins, "Thou mothering me, God, giver of breath and bread, world, strand, sway of the sea, Lord of living and dead, over again I feel thy finger and find thee." So that probably is in stone the greatest thing he ever did. Right, let's see what's next. Yes, in the little chapel at Ditchling, this is his memorial, in the little chapel that he more or less designed and where he worshipped during the years he was there, carved by Joseph Cribb, who was Eric Gill's first apprentice. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.